Hi, this is Sara Marks. I am the author of Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging. This is the commentary and annotations from the author for this book. Let's start with an introduction. Would it surprise you to know I wrote Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging before I wrote the first book in the series, Modern Persuasion? I think those who read the first edition of Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging, then Phi Alpha Pi, would nod in understanding. You see, after years of writing and rewriting what is now my fantasy series, The Enduring, I felt like it was time to take on something different. I remember sitting in my house during yet another blizzard in New England, watching some show about sororities, and thinking to myself, how would Pride and Prejudice be different if the Bennet sisters were sorority sisters? From there, the details fell into place, and I struggled weaving them together. I knew the story I wanted to tell, but I wasn't sure if others would be interested in it. At this point, I had been reading Jane Austen fanfiction for a few years, primarily Regency-era stories. But I'm not a big fan of historical fiction. I just love Mr. Darcy. I've read Pride, Prejudice, and Zombies. I've read a series from Mr. Darcy's point of view. I've read After the Wedding, high heat, lots of sex, romance between them. At the point when I was conceiving of the story, I didn't have many models for what a modern version of the story would be. But it didn't take long for them to start coming. This was a subgenre that was about to become really popular. And it took me years of thinking to answer the questions as I raised them in my mind when it came to modernizing, especially around a fraternity and sorority. For example, Mrs. Bennet is always a thorn in my side, and in my case, so was Mr. Collins. Bringing in Lisbeth's life beyond campus was a struggle. How could I justify Will and Lisbeth not speaking to each other for an entire semester after seeming to find each other at every turn for the first few months? Jorge's motivations and what he does to both Ginny and Lydia had to make sense. Seduction isn't the scandal it used to be, and it wouldn't ruin anyone's reputation. Not even Lydia's, because that's the kind of girl she might have been. She would have loved to run off for a fling. In fact, did run off for a fling. I struggled, and I thought, and I think that reflected in the first edition of the book. As I got into the rest of the series, Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging, Phi Alpha Pi, stood out, and not in a good way. Not only was it written in third person, while all the others were written in first person, it had these super long chapters centered around the passing of time, each chapter being a month in the semester and school year. It also suffered from the wrong editors. It, in fact, had two editors. One was a friend who offered her services. She had experience editing, but primarily technical work. But she loved Pride and Prejudice and was really excited to help. And she had excellent feedback as a developmental editor. For example, there was one version of the dinner scene where Colin first comes to have dinner with the sorority officers. Jane's sitting on her phone texting Elizabeth the entire time. This friend reminded me that is not Jane. Jane does not do that. That is rude. And while I disagree on how rude that is these days, she was right. For Jane Bennet, that was rude. The second editor was recommended by another author. She was his editor. He writes crime and mystery and some horror. And I didn't really think about it at the time. I was new to writing, new to working with editors, and I didn't really consider that her experience with editing his grittier novels might not work for romance and women's fiction. I didn't trust myself to ignore her feedback, especially about dialogue, and she didn't like things, so she edited them out, and I trusted her. When the book was released, I realized I'd allowed her to strip out what made these characters authentic as young women, and they seemed too mature and simultaneously immature after her edits. I think readers can tell still when they read that edition it wasn't right, and they never really read the rest of the series after that. I always hesitated to talk about the books when I met readers. Modern Persuasion was easier to talk about. I loved writing it. It came so easily. Love and War in Woodhouse Hall, the book after that, was better because I worked with a different editor, someone who knew what I was trying to do, who came at it from a romance and women's fiction point of view. She edited 3 of my books: Love and War in Woodhouse Hall, Love from Northanger Park's Katie, and Unraveling Carrie Woodhouse. And I now work with a different editor, but she is someone who edits romance books. It took me a while to realize that this book was the problem in getting readers to engage with the rest of the series. And about 2 years ago from when I'm recording this, I decided it was time to make a change. See, that's the beauty of indie and self-publishing. I can make those changes anytime I need to. What I realized is I needed to re-edit some of the early books, but this one in particular needed far more than a simple review and finesse. I always believe in second chances, and my books get them too. So what happened to Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging? Well, not only did it get a new cover like all the books in the series, but it got a new title. We went from Phi Alpha Pi to Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging. And when I went to sit down and edit it, I knew I needed a whole different point of view. I had taken third person to be somewhat of an omnipotent narrator, but it wasn't getting us into our character's head to understand their motivations. I knew shifting to Lisbeth's head would change the series, and that is the edition that you can now read. It took nearly a year of rewriting the book. Not only because this was a difficult shift, it was like rewriting or writing a new version of this book, but I was also trying to write other books at the same time. But I love how it turned out, and my current editor really did a lot of good work cleaning it up, give me some great feedback, and we ended with the proofreader who cleaned up the language and made sure it read well. I think this is how the book should have been from the start. It reads so much more authentically what I imagined than the first version did. And I'm really glad I did this. But let's get into the chapters. We'll start with chapter Alpha. When I originally wrote this book, these chapters were organized differently. But when I rewrote, we made changes. Here's what you need to know about what I wanted and where all of these ideas came from. My first attempt at college, and I talk often about how I failed out. I failed out of Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. If you don't know, Tallahassee, Florida State specifically, has a very infamous situation with sorority houses, and it's not good. It's a Ted Bundy situation. The response to that was not to shut down the sorority houses, but to create what they called sleeping porches. I'll get to that. Now, I didn't rush a sorority when I was there. I didn't find it to be a very inclusive community, and I was plus size. I didn't think I had a chance. And this was only confirmed by a friend who tried to rush twice. The first time, she conveniently got lost in the system and no house ever picked her. And the second time she rushed, she was much more aggressively rejected to her face. Like me, she was heavier, but unlike me, the introvert, she was bubbly, fun, extroverted. She would have made a great addition to any group. If it hadn't been for my own intuition suggesting that I wasn't a good fit for these, her experience and expectations really solidified that, and her heart broke each time it happened. It just so happened, though, that friend brought me into a co-ed fraternity, Alpha Phi Omega. It's an organization based on some of the principles of Boy Scouting. This was a few years before some of the negative side of Boy Scouting came out, but it was focused around community service and philanthropy as opposed to partying. Now, they could party as well as a traditional Greek organization. That just wasn't their focus. They did not have a house. They had an office. I do have friends who were sorority girls. In fact, my best friend rushed a sorority, joined, and it's because of her that I got to see the inside of at least one house. The house I really wanted to base the Phi Alpha Pi sorority house on, which still is a little different than it ended up being. It was weird to go into the house with her, to go up into what I thought should be bedrooms, and to really see what felt like shared private offices with closets. The sleeping porches, those that came out of what happened with Bundy, was where they slept. And it was really like a massive room with bunk beds. It was kind of cool, but also a little introverted, wannabe alone me kept thinking, no. I was already struggling with one roommate, let alone all of them. Even though I set Phi Alpha Pi sorority in Georgia, it's predominantly what I remembered from Florida State. In Tallahassee, the sorority and fraternity houses are primarily peppered through the core of campus. The sorority houses are always beautiful. They're like neoclassical mansions or mid-century modern houses that are well taken care of. The fraternity houses are houses. I've been to parties at both. Dated a few men in fraternities. They were gross. The houses were disgusting. They're horror stories that, like, not like horror books, but like people's experiences walking into a fraternity house and really just walking into a massive man cave that no one ever cleans. Yeah, it's not fun. And as I thought about what my sorority would be like, I asked a lot of my friends and families for their experiences, like living in a Southern house. A Southern sorority house is very different than what you would get in New England. They don't have houses here. They get offices on campus. The fraternities get houses. The sorority house is a very Southern thing. And in many states, this was fun to learn, in many states you can only have so many women living in a house together before they think you're a brothel. So, most of what we think about sororities is based on what goes on in Southern sorority systems. Not only did I base the house of Phi Alpha Pi sorority house on what I saw at Florida State, but I based some of the sisters on the women I knew in my time there. There are times when Elizabeth's jaded pragmatism to her role is how I think I might have been a sorority, but Marie's experience is more akin to what I really would have been. Lydia was fun to write because she's the girl stereotype. She's a silly girl stereotype of sorority member. And most people don't know about the formal rituals and traditions. They only know that the drunk girls make the headlines, get all the attention. And they're known for excluding those who don't look perfect. And they haze. And they body shame. Yeah. I knew I didn't want to write something that highlighted those cruelties, especially around hazing and exclusion. But I wanted to write about the good things. And that's around creating a network of women who support each other outside of the sorority. Many of my friends who were in sororities still speak to their sorority sisters on social media or tap them for networking. Even Elizabeth, Jane, and Charlotte, presumably the most mature of the sorority sisters, made mistakes. And I'm amused when people push back on the maturity of these characters. I don't think people remember their childhoods and young adulthoods the same way. Primarily because we all have such different experiences once we turn 18. And going to college allows you to sort of extend your childhood a bit longer. But we often forget that our frontal lobes aren't fully developed till we're 25. And many of these young women are sheltered. Of course we're going to act like children. sometimes. They're entering adulthood. They're still performing it, not being adults. And Will is also performing adulthood, but with much higher stakes for him. He and Charlotte are two people without the safety nets the others have. Will's an adult in his family. Will's the adult in his family. His parents are gone. He's responsible for his younger sister. He has the weight of the world on his shoulders, and his societal anxiety is through the roof on top of it. So we'll get to Jorge and the distress centered around that for him. But I think for him and Lisbeth, who are both highly privileged, they're aware that not only will they use their privilege to gain things, but others will try to manipulate them to gain access to that privilege. Both have their walls up. They're so strong for Lisbeth that she doesn't even realize that she and Will are doing the same thing, are like two very similar people. Side note, in this chapter, I think there's a reference to Trump that was written well before he ran for president. This is when running for president for him was a joke. Chapter Beta. Now, as I mentioned, originally these chapters were organized in a much longer way. They were organized by month and by semester, and when I rewrote the book, I realized that wasn't working. It needed to be smaller chapters with more of a cliffhanger to sort of carry you through to the next one, but also give you a succinct moment in the book that you needed to sort of compartmentalize in a way. And when I realized I had the perfect amount of chapters, I decided to relabel them all around the Greek alphabet. It was just a moment of serendipity that there were the perfect amount to do that. In Chapter Beta, we meet Colin Collins. I still work with college students. I've been working with college students for over 20 years. I've seen men like him. I've been in classes with them as a student. I've learned to be aggressive as a participant in conversations because of these men. When I wrote this book, I was working for a man like Colin. Yes, Colin and Mrs. C are caricatures, but they're based on people I know. They say a lot of things that have been said to me, not just around me. Chapter Gamma. I had a lot of plans for Caroline, and a lot of it had to get cut from the original version, but I know a lot of women like her. She's the woman who wants the life she's supposed to have instead of the life of her authentic self. And there's some bonus content out there that talks about her asexuality. This is something she struggles with because she is beautiful, and many people want to initiate her sexually, which she doesn't enjoy. Eventually, she will find a partner who understands her and wants to be with her and maintain an asexual relationship, but they are not asexual themselves. So it creates a lot more problems for the couple, but she does find someone she loves. I think Caroline is the closest I've come to writing a character who's as cruel as some sorority members can be. But she looks down at the sorority sisters and Phi Alpha Pi, even though they openly welcomed her. We also see the start of Colin's weird obsession with Lisbeth here. I had to do a lot of thinking about the reasons he might be fixated with her so quickly. In the original Pride and Prejudice, Mrs. Bennet positions Collins in Elizabeth's direction because she wants Jane with Bingley. That doesn't really work here because Mrs. C does not have that kind of influence on these girls' lives. She's already trying to exert more influence than she's entitled to. It was also too early to give Mrs. C's motivations clarity for the readers. I really I wanted it to seem like he was fixating on her for no reason initially, but there are reasons. Of all the modernizations that I've written, this is the one where I felt the desire to hit each beat of the original, and I had to do a lot of work understanding the new character motivations for being the way they were, and want the things that aren't as important in society anymore, like Colin needing to get married. Chapter Delta. I was going to get this story to Paris, no matter how hard I had to work at it. And I knew that as soon as I started writing. I had not done well in language classes. Personally, I'm not language oriented in my brain, but my favorite projects were those where we got to share cultures, food, history, tourist attractions, and more from countries or cities that I wanted to visit. So when I thought of the scene around Jane getting stuck at Netherfield, in this case, the townhouse, having this project for the three women made it a lot easier to get them together. I just needed to get them sort of in close proximity and away from parties for that more intimate opportunities, much like Jane Austen did with the original. Now, why are they living in such a nice townhouse off campus? Again, this was based on things I saw at Florida State. You didn't have to live in a dorm. And back in the 1990s, when I lived in dorms, they were really shared rooms. 2 to 3 people. Maybe you would be lucky if you got a single. But you had a couple of housing options if that's what you didn't want. I did a few of them. First, you could do a private dorm. This was really good if you wanted to live with someone who went to a different school or you went to a school that did not have dorms. I did this with a friend at the local community college. It did not go well. Your parents could buy you a home and you could share it with friends. I did not do this. My parents could not afford that. You could rent an apartment. Some would come furnished. That was great for college students. Others did not. I did the type that did not come furnished. I had enough furnishing. Or at least I thought I did. I did not, but I did. We had to buy some at Goodwill. And when you're bougie like me, you sort of get your back hair up about that. But I didn't want a furnished apartment. And the girl I was sharing the apartment with had already done the furnished one and didn't like it. I had a friend of mine who did rent a furnished apartment in a very unique living situation that I have never seen done anywhere since, but mostly because I haven't looked and I've been in New England. You were renting the room in the apartment, not the apartment itself. So you might end up with 2 to 3 other people you didn't know at all. You got a key to your room that had an ensuite bathroom for your privacy, but you shared the common rooms with the other people. Now, it allowed people who might have lost a living situation or their circumstances changed to get an affordable room without having to negotiate with people living in apartments who might have you living in their dining room or living room. The friend I had who did this situation ended up being alone in her apartment. And as each of the other 2 people moved out, they left copies of their key with her so she could get into those rooms. And no one ever rented the other rooms in the year she was there. So we knew we had a place to crash if things got really bad. There were times I almost did. There were times I considered moving into one of those rooms when my living situation became unbearable, but I was dealing with other things at the time. Well, eventually, other dorms on college campuses were built around this model, and I know you can rent an apartment on campus, and you basically have a room with a common shared area. But this was new at the time. This was still the mid-1990s. And of course, you could rent a townhouse, which I also did. And then you were living in a townhouse. I love living in townhouses, still do to this day. My favorite way. Now, most were unfurnished, but I figured this is a modern story, not Sarah's 1990s memories. You'd probably be able to get furnished ones. And I realized Charlie, Caroline, and Will, they would be looking for something higher end. in a furnished townhouse. They wouldn't want to have to buy furniture because they're not necessarily going to stay there long. This would be a place that was probably more intended for young professionals rather than college students. But it worked. And of course, the turnabout the rune scene was a moment that I went back and forth about. It's a great petty moment for Caroline in the original book because she's envious of Elizabeth and annoyed that Darcy wants to pay attention to her. And in this book, Caroline's trying to maintain the upper hand. She needs Elizabeth to understand that she controls these men. I couldn't take that moment from her. Chapter Epsilon. All right, let's discuss Jorge. I'm gonna say this. When I conceived of the character, Game of Thrones was super popular and still good. Yes, a modern version of Elizabeth Bennet is going to sleep with Pedro Pascal. I maintain this. Any woman who looks at Pedro Pascal and thinks he's attractive is going to want to sleep with him in this day and age. How they get to that moment is often fantasy, obviously. But when I was conceiving of this character, he was playing Oberyn Martell, and I loved him in that role. He was so great at that moral complexity of justified, righteous desire for revenge, but also debauchery without a care. I needed him to be Jorge. And now I need to redeem Jorge because I've seen The Mandalorian. I have seen him in so many other things, and he's so delightful. The Mandalorian was the moment I was convinced that he could be redeemed if I just worked really, really hard. And he will be. I promise you, Jorge's getting his redemption in another series, but it's coming. The point is, yes, she would have slept with him. I know some people hate the idea, but in my book, she is 21. He's hot. They're into each other, and they're consenting. In the original Pride and Prejudice, she had nothing but trust for him until he ditches her at the Netherfield ball. Jorge is amazing when you consider it. He has no problems with Mrs. C and Colin. He's polite and inclusive. If he wasn't a narcissist and a criminal, he could use those powers for good. And hopefully he will. We'll see. In this chapter, we also get the first reference to Elizabeth's real family. Her parents really kind of fill in the role the Gardners did in the original. They were a chance to pull her away from her family or her sorority family. And I expanded the role that they played because I needed her to be in a place where she could relax and feel safe as opposed to always having her walls up. They gave me a chance to connect a few people, like bringing Catherine in from a different direction. And it helped make Catherine specifically the villain of the entire series and upcoming spin-off series. Yeah, Catherine's our villain. Jorge can be redeemed. Catherine cannot. Chapter Zeta. Something I love about the 2005 adaptation of Pride and Prejudice was how they shot the Netherfield ball. And I'm going to say this, I love a lot of things, including emo Darcy, including like the hand clenching scene, but also Bingley's just utter delight at the world, sort of puppy dogs energy. There's so much I love about that one, but the way they shot the Netherfield ball, if you've never been to a college party before, it is strikingly similar to that. There are a lot of things happening in a very small space at a college party, especially if it's at someone's apartment. A group of people are going to be outside on the deck having one conversation. Another group will be playing drinking games at the kitchen table. A third group will be doing keg stands in the kitchen. A few people might be off in bedrooms, fighting or fucking. Someone will walk in and make their way from group to group as they say hello. And it's an interesting solar system of things circling that apartment or house. That's the vibe I wanted for this party. If Elizabeth is our camera, she's trying to take in everything and process what's going on. When you're the designated driver or the sober sister, you have to be vigilant about what people are doing so you can keep them safe. There is always been so much danger at these parties. So much danger for women especially. Often it starts as an exciting night and can turn on a dime. And I loved writing this because I wanted to layer in this as the moment to give the readers so many winks to the original, while also allowing Will to be uncomfortable in his own home, because he definitely is. Why doesn't Elizabeth know what's going on between her and Will, or between Charlotte and Colin? Why does she lose track of Marie and Jane? Okay. I have a comparison that has nothing to do with Austen or romance. It's about Twin Peaks. It's a universe I love. If you want to talk Twin Peaks, leave a message in the comments of this video. We'll talk Twin Peaks. One of the things I love to do, especially now, is watch the theory videos on YouTube, look for the Easter eggs, and pay attention to the details that might be important. After the third season, which is now nearly a decade ago, I really got into the YouTube channels with other people sharing their explanations for what it all means, especially around the context of the Lynch's original intention, what he tried to do with Fire Walk with Me, and what he hoped to do with the third season. There's some really amazing theories out there. I believe all of them and none of them simultaneously, but there's one 4-hour explanation video that posed an interesting idea. The creator said, among other things, Lynch is aware of the fans who pay attention to every little detail and what it could possibly mean. But they don't pay attention to the bigger picture and what's actually going on around them or in the scene itself. They're too busy looking for the Easter eggs or the weird clues. That's what Elizabeth is dealing with. She's focused on the details at the expense of what's actually going on around her. She wanted to find her people and get out of the party because she was not having fun. She was not observing what was actually going on with those people. She doesn't see how upset Marie is. She just wants to get Marie and get out of there. She doesn't have the mental capacity to ask Jane what happened to Charlie because she just wants to get out of there. Nor does she have the ability to add that to her mental load. She's already handling as much as she can in that moment and leading up to the end of the semester. Anyway, if you want to talk about Twin Peaks theories, email me. I really love them, no matter how bonkers they are. The weirder the better for me, because it's not that I'll agree or disagree. I just like hearing them and seeing how you've made that connection. Chapter Ada. Austen was not nice to Mary, Kitty, or Lydia. I'm going to tell you that. I could die on that hill. I don't know if I want to, but I could. And I understand how Kitty and Mary feel. I wanted to do better by all three of them. Lydia might be silly, rash, and thoughtless, but she has to be good at something. The same for Kitty and Mary, in my case, Marie. I had to make sure each of them was given moments to shine, even if they were small moments. I made Elizabeth's presentation to the class as I was writing this. It was bonus content, but I was writing in the wake of Gamergate, and it highlighted Elizabeth's conflict with Colin while facing Colin and Will. It also provided a chance to show Will that he didn't need to take care of her or make her point for her. She may still be irritated and in denial about things, but at this moment, he falls in love with her. He's been carrying everyone's emotional loads because he has that strong sense of responsibility. And for someone to refuse to let him carry their load was a relief and made him more comfortable with her. Chapter Theta. But we all know what comes next. The proposal. And one of my early inspirations for how a modernization could be handled was the Lizzie Bennet Diaries, which, as I am recording this, is having their 10-year anniversary, and I'm super excited, and I might entirely binge it. Join me on Patreon if you want to do that with me. There's probably content there if you're listening to this well after I record it. So the Lizzie Bennet Diaries made me excited to write this book after a few years of thinking about it. They handled the Colin Charlotte plotline as a professional partnership. And if you haven't watched it yet, obviously please do. I love that show, and the actor they got for Colin is delightful. He also does Disneyland and Disney related videos on YouTube. He's wonderful. His name's Max. He loves wine and baseball and Disney, and he's a voice actor, and he's done some voices, especially if you have kids, you've probably heard his voice a lot. Anyway, Colin is a mama's boy. He has been happy to follow her direction. Charlotte will realize later that he will follow whichever woman leads him. So far, it's been his mother. He's had a few ideas on his own, some good ones, but in his life, he needs someone to make it work, and he thinks it's a woman. But he doesn't really want Lisbeth. She won't lead him. She'll blow past him and leave him coughing in her dust. Austen's version of this man will take anyone with a heartbeat, but my Colin is being taught how to behave by a woman who has her own ideas of who her son should be. For all of these characters, this is a story of, and this is very often the themes of my books, not being who you're supposed to be or who other people want you to be, but being who you are. It's a classic problem for modern people. Chapter Iota. By the time I wrote this chapter, I had a strong sense of who Charlotte was and what she didn't want to return to. I had made a friend from Detroit. She was lovely, and this was when she and I became friends. The news was really focused on the decline of the Detroit area and how the water supply was not good and how little people there had. And her story ended up becoming a lot of Charlotte's story. But I knew I wanted to keep that marriage element in it. It didn't make sense without it for Charlotte to up and leave school. But given what I knew of her background, it made sense for her to take an opportunity, even if it meant she didn't finish the way she thought she would. When I edited it, I knew I could give some stronger emphasis on helping Lisbeth understand, because she's very confused about why Charlotte marries Colin and has to move away. But from the artists I know, when you have a benefactor or someone who's going to help you find benefactors, you might want to do things that seem out of pocket. Not out of pocket. We don't use it the same way. Out of typical actions for you. Most artists I know end up teaching art or working another job to make ends meet so that they can do their art, and that's something Charlotte very much wants to avoid. But she wants a safe home, and this is a man who likes her, who she likes. She is attracted to him. It's not the perfect situation, but it's one she can live with to get to her other goals. But Lisbeth hasn't noticed the time Colin and Charlotte are spending together, so the reader doesn't know it either. And this was the struggle with the third person. It's still third person. It was centered on Lisbeth, and I didn't write enough about what Charlotte was doing from that perspective. And thus it made more sense when we were just in Lisbeth's head. Charlotte does fall in love with Colin, but it's not that hot, passionate love we're looking for. And for a while, she does get her happily ever after. It just doesn't last. Chapter Kappa. Gardner is a real place in central Massachusetts. I had not yet thought of Lecoq, but it was going to be what Lecoq started out as in my head. It is, in fact, the furniture capital of Massachusetts. It's this freaking cute little ski resort, community college, lots of farm kind of town. It was about 20 minutes away from where I lived for about 6 years after I got my first job. And I knew I wanted to put Catherine and Elizabeth's parents there. I spent so much time there. I knew the farms, I knew the vast amounts of land people could own, but also how just quaint in New England it was. It was an early decision when I was outlining that Elizabeth is hiding details of her true identity to everyone. But when they get to Gardner, she's not just withholding, she's actively lying. She is actively aware that Catherine and Will have no idea how she's already connected to them. Catherine's at war with Elizabeth's grandparents. Will wants to buy Elizabeth's horse. Catherine is trying to invest in Jack's restaurant without knowing that Elizabeth is his daughter and the neighbors are his in-laws. There's only one person there who knows anything, and that's Charlotte. All of this gives Elizabeth the upper hand, and she thinks this is a battle of wills. Will Darcy is playing a very different game at this point. He's in love. Side note, if you read Sweeten Up Ginny Darcy, we have another Thanksgiving with Catherine where she acts like the asshole all over again. She really is the worst. And yes, Anne will get her story someday. She is, in fact, inspired by Lydia Dietz. But I couldn't name her Lydia because she's not Lydia. Chapter Lambda. I love horses. I have some experience riding them. When I was young, I went to a day camp where we all got to ride horses every day. And until the 1990s, there were a lot of stables around Miami. But I was thrown from a horse when I was about 5 and rode much more sporadically until I was about 10 and then took lessons again as part of a Girl Scout project. I think I would enjoy riding again. I remember enough to write about it, but what I really want is a unicorn. Since those are unavailable, Elizabeth knows more about horses than I do. I did have to do a little research, and she also learns a lot in this chapter. Chapter Moo. You know what time it is. The failed proposal. Honestly, the proposals in this book are really like not just the original, but the key moments we're all waiting for. This one makes no sense in a modernization. No sense. Darcy's proposal does not work in a modern context at this point in their relationship. And I've already married off Charlotte, and it felt like a stretch, even to the readers who gave me feedback. There was a lot of questions about motivation. So I wasn't, even when I was writing the first draft, I knew there was no way we were going to do that. You can't go from enemies to spouses in a modern book. Well, you can, but that's not what this book is. I wanted to maintain the indignation and sting for both of them. And what I was really looking to have happen was for Will to see how wrong he's been about Elizabeth. She learned everything in the last chapter. Now it's his turn to see who she really is. But she also has to learn more of the truth, too. Now, this is the mirror moment for both Elizabeth and Will. And if you ever go to the middle of a book or a movie, you often see this happening in the plot. In some stories, it's the main character will literally look in a mirror. But for some, it's switching from them being reactive to proactive, for them to make a massive decision about changing their life. They look in the mirror and they're like, I'm going to do better. That's it. That's what's happening. Elizabeth and Will have to reconcile the truths they've learned about themselves and each other with their own behavior. But since we're only in Elizabeth's head, we see her changes the clearest. Chapter New. Now it's time for Elizabeth to make those changes, but she's still ignoring things, or at least unable to add those details into her mental load. She's only able to add the increased scrutiny of Mrs. C's actions and reputations of the sorority sisters, and thus the sorority. She's also not responsible for everyone. Chapter Chai. Or Shy. I never remember how to pronounce Psy. I think Psy. Xi. I think Elizabeth's family is the most like the Gardners in the original. She gets away from her family, quote fingers, at school with the ease and comfort of those who get her. We get to see who raised her and in what environment. This is important because she's a different person with her family. If allowed to, she'd be a different version of herself with Will, and she'd see the real Will. She's also able to give him a chance because her family can see and help her in a way her sorority sisters can't. Also, Becca's a force of nature. She takes the wheel even though we don't see much of her driving. The library bedroom is a fantasy I have. I want it, but I wanted it in this book from the moment I thought about it. Chapter Omicron. I love this chapter. I loved writing it. The balcony, looking over New York at night. The thrill Ginny feels when her brother comes out of his room. Elizabeth seeing a happy little boy in photos and wondering what happened to him. Becca happily taking the wheel while Elizabeth catches her breath. The jacket. The fans of the 2005 Pride and Prejudice adaptation are obsessed with the scene when Darcy helps Elizabeth into the carriage and he flexes his hand. Love it. Love it. Those who love the 1996 adaptation are obsessed with Darcy getting out of the lake, and I'm obsessed with the way Will inhales Elizabeth's scent on his jacket. Nothing else matters. That's the first thing I knew would happen in this book. Chapter 5. Pie. Food, art, roosters, all the cock jokes. Fuck Caroline, but thank you, Charlie. I don't think the original Pride and Prejudice does a great job of showing comfort growing between Elizabeth and Darcy. It's a joke in the Austen reader community that Elizabeth falls in love with Pemberley more than Darcy. I don't disagree, but a modern romance story is about two people falling in love with each other. They have to get to know each other. They have to see what they have in common and what the other is amused by. This one trip knocks down a lot of walls between the couple. That is, of course, until Caroline shows up and Will shuts down, unable to function. Chapter Row, fuck Caroline. I seriously considered letting Will and Elizabeth kiss as they rushed out of the museum or after dinner, but I knew the tension had to be maintained just a little longer. It's that tension we love from the original. I knew he wouldn't be the one to kiss her first. But also, Becca, not just being my favorite, is a megalomaniac. She will protect the people she likes, but she will burn the world down if that's what it takes to protect the ones she loves. But also she's a megalomaniac. She will rule the world someday. When I hear Billie Eilish's song, You Should See Me in a Crown, I think of Becca. And I might write another version of her very soon. Chapter Sigma. It took me a while to break down what happened to Lydia. And some of it I didn't want to say outright. Someone once asked me if there was a sexual assault, and I still don't know. Lydia will keep her secrets. Still, Lisbeth's reaction and shutting Will down was critical, and I don't think I did it very well the first time. Doing the edits made it a lot easier, coming from her point of view. It's one of the reasons I didn't want the tension between them to break with a kiss in the previous chapter. She can't think he could help her with this. She can't think anyone can help her with this. Mrs. C was the other tricky plot point. Some people didn't like that she was struggling with mental health, but it made sense to me. I was raised by baby boomers. I grew up surrounded by them. They live in denial about their mental health and see it as a failure. They might let their kids go to therapy, but you better not suggest they do too. Mrs. C is the type of woman who will run away and avoid dealing with her mess. As the story unravels, so does everyone's sense of control. Lisbeth focuses on what she can control. Chapter Tau. We have a very different Lydia. In the original, her choice to reveal Darcy's role in her marriage feels more like Lydia poking at her older sister rather than letting the details slip out. This Lydia is traumatized, capital T, and is trying to fix things. She knew early in the book that there was something between Will and Lisbeth. There's even a moment where she just says, you should sleep with him already. She's talked to Ginny now and has a mission. Lydia might be a high energy extrovert who loves being the center of attention, but she's so fucking fun to write. So very different from me. Chapter Upsilon. Every organization I have ever been part of has an end-of-the-year event like this. I knew it was the perfect event to bring Charlie, Will, and Caroline back into the story. Lisbeth is still working on herself, but Will is doing the same. And I think a lot of readers expected the reunion to happen at this point, but we haven't dealt with something yet. Also, I love how Charlie may look chaotic, but there is a plan. Between this and the museum, this man sees more than he's given credit for. Chapter 5. Paris. Not only did I prepare Lisbeth's class assignment for her gender class, but I did their Paris tour too. There's something on my YouTube video channel somewhere with the slideshow of it. This is based on a tour my best friend Emily and I did when we went to Paris together. I still love that trip. It was my favorite trip anywhere. She is our Caroline in the museum, by the way, Emily. She hates art museums. She was very generous and let me go into, not only did she let me go into one about Picasso with this weird goat statue in the middle of the entrance, but she also let me go into Centre Pompidou. I love contemporary and modern art more than I love classical things. I don't want to see a portrait of a person, especially a white man. But give me a brain to stand on and climb around, and I'm a child again. So Emily hated always needing to see the art I wanted to see, but she was the one who knew where to go get the challah in the Jewish quarter. So she had that one. It was amazing. Anyway, Caroline is clearly here to do something. In the original, it is Catherine who confronts Elizabeth. But that's not the dynamic here. Catherine, in my book, has no real influence over Will. Caroline is the one who dislikes her and wants Will for herself. The last-minute change on Caroline's part and the lack of engagement she has is a clear sign that something's up. Also, I'm Jane when I travel. Every statue is taken, there's a picture of it with a picture of the plaque so that I can make photo albums and write the descriptions of what's on the plaque so I know what I'm looking at. I print my photo albums on big international trips. Chapter 5. Lisbeth still needs information before she can be with Will. Caroline's meltdown in Paris confuses her. We still need to know what happened with Mrs. C. Everyone needs to see that Charlotte and Colin are happy for now. The cafe scene was another early scene when I was writing this book. She's ready to be direct, but knows she can only push Will so far. In the book, in my conception of it, I was actually sitting in Starbucks when I conceived of this scene, and I knew she was going to have to kiss him, at the very least on the cheek. But she's learning how to be with him, what he needs. She takes a chance and knows it could bite her in the ass, but someone has to make the first move, and she's happy to be that person. Chapter Sigh. No, I did not write Lisbeth's thesis, but I can see why you thought I might, because I considered it. I have written a thesis from my own education over the years. I did an undergraduate honors thesis, and for one of my 2 master's degrees, I have written a thesis. Having to write a dissertation is, in fact, why I don't really rush into getting a PhD. I don't have that kind of energy anymore. I want to write romance and horror and fantasy, not academics. But I didn't want to take that far. I just needed to do a few things. Mainly, I needed to do 2 things here. First, this is something that has commanded Lisbeth's time and energy. This is the 2 main mental loads she is carrying. You can't really do anything else when you are writing a dissertation or a thesis. it becomes everything. I have missed time with friends because I was so focused on getting it ready. One year for National Novel Writing Month, I wrote my thesis so I could spend time with my friends who were writing their novels. So, yeah, it can be a lot. It's why she didn't seek out Will during the semester. I also wanted to give her a chance to see that Will has a sense of humor. We see it in the museum, and he gets to come back in with another cock joke. It's a sign that he's no longer being reactive either. He may not be ready to kiss her first, but taking her out for dinner is a big deal. They're both present and open to each other in a way that they can only get from 9 months of growth from themselves. Once they connect, they can finally tear down all those walls. Chapter Omega. We wrap up the book the way we wrap up school papers and school years. Graduations. In this case, most of our main characters graduate. We look forward to what will happen. In the original version, Lisbeth and Will promptly move in together. No, my version. Readers didn't like that, but they didn't like that she slept with Jorge, so whatever. Honestly, they were right about that one, the not moving right in together. Sort of. These things happen. Sometimes you see living together is just a quick and easy solution to some problem, in their case, a summer solution, but they end up living together permanently. She wants that library bedroom. Not just him. To wrap up, rewriting the book was an interesting exercise to see how I've changed as a writer since I wrote the first draft in 2013. No, 2013. No, 2014. It's been a decade since I wrote the book initially, and it had been almost a decade and a half since I first conceived of it. I felt that changing it to first-person narrator allowed me and readers to connect better with Lisbeth's emotions, inner voice, and perspective. When I write in third person, I still struggle with getting in the characters' heads, and telling anyone's story, is not allowing them to tell their own story. And I really want them to tell their own story. I hope you liked this set of annotated and commentary moments from Pride, Prejudice, and Pledging. If you want more, Lisbeth has peppered her way through many of these novels in this series. She is, of course, in Sweeten Up Jenny Darcy, and she will be featured in the final book, Citation Needed. Title could change. But thank you for joining me with this and sticking around for however long it took me to record this and for you to listen to it. Like and subscribe if you want more. Oh wait, this is a YouTube video, but thank you for joining me. I'll see you in another one.